Hello, this is Charles Taylor from the Friendship Church of Christ, and we're going to do a midweek lesson this morning. I wanted to take a break from what we've been studying, which was 1 Peter chapter 1, and talk about this subject, civil submission, or what we are to do, or what we are called, the people we are called to be as Christians in any society, all right? Whether it be in this country or another country. We're going to look at some scriptures that talk about how Jesus and how the apostles addressed this very subject. The first thing I want to point out is that God did indeed intend for humans to be governed, right? If we look at the way He used and set up the nation of Israel, He had appointed various leaders for them, right? Whether it be Moses, whether it be Joshua, whether it be the time of the judges or the time of the kings, there was always an authority to submit to. If we look at Daniel chapter 4, that it reads there that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and He gives them to whomever He wills. So He gives that authority to whomever He wills. Now, we know that those in authority don't often make the best decisions. Why? They're human beings. They're like us. They're subject to the same moral failings. They're subject to the same intellectual failings as we are. So when we read that in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, the prophet there wasn't saying that they were in their position because they were perfect. Far from it. In fact, we can read in Daniel about the failings of all the kings that Daniel served under, whether they were Babylonian or Persian. Our second point is that we do indeed submit to those authorities. That's the type of people we are called to be, right? And I want us to think about that and how that standard, how we're reflecting that standard in our lives. So we're called to honor those in authority over us. We're called to submit to their authority. It doesn't mean that we can't be critical of some of the decisions that are being made. It doesn't mean that we have to endorse every one of those decisions, but we are indeed called to submit to their authority. I noticed that in my own household, if maybe one of the kids says something critical against a politician, I have to correct them and say, no, this is a person of authority, and you are to show respect for that position. Let's look at Romans chapter 13, right? Verse 1, where Paul says something very poignant there. Think about who he's writing this to. He's writing it to the church in Rome, a mixed pagan and Jewish congregation, and the church in Rome had to go through various hardships, right? And depending on who the emperor was, at one point he'd expelled all the Jews. Later on, the Christians came under heavy persecution. And Paul writes them this in Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. All right, so pretty powerful statement there. Paul is saying in Romans 13, verse 1, again, he's not saying they're perfect. Later on, he makes the point that what they should be doing is promoting what's best for the society. Later on, he says their rulers are not a terror, or they shouldn't be a terror for good works, but for the evil works. So in a good government system, that's going to hold true, that those in authority, they're no threat for those who are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But rather those that are doing things that tear down the country or tear down the society. And what we see is that the Christians took that attitude to heart. The Christians were model citizens in the first century. In fact, they were commended by multiple Roman officials when we read some of what they wrote back 2,000 years ago. How about this one? This is 1 Peter chapter 2. Therefore verse 13, therefore submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether the king is supreme or to governors, or as to those who are sent by him. So we're submitting, and our submitting is for the Lord's sake. Remember what the ultimate authority is, and we're going to get back to that in our third point, that the authority is by God given to these people. If they weren't in power, it's because guess what? God does not will them to be in power. It's a verse that talks about we make all these plans as men, and yet if the Lord doesn't will it to be, it's not going to happen. And our third point is, of course, and we already read about it in Romans chapter 13, is there is indeed a hierarchy to our submission. Going back to Romans chapter 13, there is no authority except from God. And indeed, our highest authority is from God. And there's a hierarchy to our submission. And we think about in this country, yes, the local government is subordinate to the state government, is subordinate to the federal government. And likewise, all our submission is under the headship of what? Christ. I mean, that's the hierarchy of authority is spelled out in the New Testament. It says Christ is our head. He's the head of the church. He's who everyone submits to. And it says that the man is the head of his own household, right? So those underneath him will submit to his authority. There always is a hierarchy to that submission. And where the rubber meets the road, depending on civil authorities, which we submit to the best of our abilities, versus our heavenly authority, which is Christ, we're going to submit to Christ first and foremost. Acts chapter 5. Remember, Peter and John are getting into all sorts of trouble because they're preaching and teaching in Jerusalem, and they have to appear before the Sanhedrin, and they come to a conclusion that said, we have to obey God rather than men. And of course, this subject is in the news a lot lately. Lately, right now, specifically, there's been some criticism over what the government here in Kentucky has laid out with regard to what we can and cannot do when we return to in-person worship services. And a couple of things that were mentioned, were specifically, well, they said that they're discouraging us heavily from singing, and two, they're discouraging us heavily from the way we take the Lord's Supper. Well, the truth is, if we are going to assemble, if we're going to submit to the authority of Christ, He expects us in worship to sing, and He expects us to commune or partake of the Lord's Supper with one another, and those things are non-negotiable. Why? Because we are submitting to God. And He's the higher up in that hierarchy. So I want us to think about how we can, of course, show respect for those civil authorities, how we can obey them to the best of our conscience, but also pointing out there is a higher authority to God. Thank you.